Washington, D.C., July 1930. A leather folder lands on a mahogany desk inside the War Department. The stamp on the cover reads, "Top Secret." Inside are maps covered in red arrows. The arrows point north. They point at Halifax, at Montreal, at Toronto, at Winnipeg. They point at every major Canadian city. This is not a defensive plan. This is not a contingency for occupation. This is an instruction manual for conquest. We are told that the border between the United States and Canada is the longest undefended frontier in the world. We are told it represents friendship and trust between two peaceful neighbors. But the document in that folder tells a different story. It tells the story of a nation that measured its neighbor not in miles of friendship, but in tons of nickel, barrels of oil, and bushels of wheat. War Plan Red was not about ideology. It was not about democracy or freedom. It was about the ledger. And in that ledger, Canada was not an ally. Canada was an asset waiting to be liquidated. To understand why the United States planned to invade Canada, you have to forget everything you think you know about borders and brotherhood. You have to see North America the way a banker sees a balance sheet. On one side, you have resources. On the other side, you have control. In the 1920s and 1930s, the arithmetic was simple. Canada had what America needed, and America had the guns to take it. This was not madness. This was accounting with artillery. The men who wrote War Plan Red were not warmongers. They were accountants in uniform. They calculated the cost of invasion versus the cost of dependence. They ran the numbers, and the numbers said invade. Let's go back to the moment when America looked strongest. The year is 1918. The First World War has ended. Europe is a graveyard. The factories of France are rubble. The banks of London are drowning in debt. But across the Atlantic, America is untouched. Its factories are humming. Its farms are feeding the world. Its vaults are filled with European gold. The United States emerges from the war not just as a victor, but as the creditor of the world. Britain owes America over $4 billion. France owes even more. The British Empire, which once ruled the waves, now owes its survival to American loans. But empires do not like being debtors, and creditors do not like being ignored. Throughout the 1920s, tension builds between Washington and London. It is not the tension of armies. It is the tension of interest rates and repayment schedules. Britain refuses to pay back its war debts. British politicians argue that the money was spent fighting a common enemy. American politicians argue that a debt is a debt. The rhetoric gets ugly. American newspapers call Britain a deadbeat empire. British newspapers call America a vulture nation. Trade disputes erupt over rubber, over oil, over shipping routes. The admirals in both capitals start counting battleships. And in the basement offices of the War Department, the strategists start asking a dangerous question. If we go to war with Britain, how do we win? The answer is written in geography. Britain is an island protected by the Royal Navy. An invasion across the Atlantic is suicide. But Britain has a weakness. It has a dominion that stretches across the top of North America. A dominion that is loyal to the crown but defended by a tiny militia. A dominion that is rich in resources and separated from Britain by 3,000 miles of ocean. Canada is not a threat to America. Canada is a hostage. If war breaks out between Washington and London, Canada will be legally obligated to fight for the king. Canadian ports will become bases for British warships. Canadian factories will supply British troops. So the American planners decide that the best defense is a preemptive strike. They decide to cut off Britain's lifeline before the Royal Navy can mobilize. They decide to seize Canada. War Plan Red is not a fantasy. It is a fully funded operational guide. The budget for the plan runs into the tens of millions of dollars. Airfields are constructed near the Canadian border under the guise of civilian infrastructure. Troop movements are rehearsed in secret exercises. Chemical weapons are stockpiled in depots in upstate New York. The plan is updated every year throughout the 1920s and early 1930s. It is signed off by generals, by admirals, by secretaries of war. This is official United States policy. The goal is not to defeat Canada. The goal is to annex it. The goal is to erase the border and turn the Dominion into a series of American territories. This is economic consolidation at gunpoint. Now let's talk about what Canada has that America wants. First, there is nickel. In the 1930s, nickel is the most strategic metal on Earth. You cannot build modern armor without it. You cannot build battleship hulls without it. And 90% of the world's nickel comes from one place, Sudbury, Ontario. The mines at Sudbury produce more nickel than the rest of the planet combined. Whoever controls Sudbury controls the global arms industry. The German military knows this. The Japanese military knows this, and the American military knows this. War Plan Red identifies Sudbury as Target Priority 1. The plan calls for a mechanized column to bypass Toronto and drive straight for the mines. The orders are explicit. Seize the facilities intact. If the Canadians attempt sabotage, shoot the engineers. This is not conquest. This is corporate raiding with tanks. Second, there is wheat. The Canadian prairies are the breadbasket of the British Empire. Manitoba and Saskatchewan produce enough grain to feed London, to feed Calcutta, to feed Sydney. If America controls the wheat, America controls Britain's food supply. War Plan Red calls for the seizure of Winnipeg within 72 hours of invasion. Winnipeg is the rail hub that connects east and west. If you cut the rail line at Winnipeg, you starve Vancouver. If you starve Vancouver, you choke off the Pacific supply route. The American strategists understand that modern war is not won on battlefields. It is won in grain silos and freight yards. Control the calories, control the empire. Third, there is hydroelectric power. Niagara Falls generates more electricity than any other site in North America. The power plants on the Canadian side supply Ontario's factories. Those factories produce steel, produce munitions, produce the industrial output that keeps the British war machine running. War Plan Red calls for the destruction of the Canadian power stations in the first hour of the invasion. American bombers will take off from airfields in Buffalo and obliterate the turbines. The lights will go out in Toronto. The factories will go silent. Ontario will be paralyzed. This is economic decapitation. You do not need to occupy a city if you can turn off its electricity. Fourth, there is the Atlantic Gateway. Halifax is the only major port on Canada's east coast that does not freeze in winter. It is the docking point for British troop ships. It is the repair yard for the Royal Canadian Navy. If Britain wants to reinforce Canada, every soldier and every ton of supplies has to come through Halifax. So War Plan Red calls for an amphibious assault on the city. 25,000 Marines will storm the beaches. Naval artillery will bombard the harbour. And here is the darkest detail in the entire document. The plan authorizes the use of poison gas. If the Canadian defenders dig in, if they turn Halifax into a fortress, American forces are cleared to deploy chemical weapons. This is 8 years after the Geneva Protocol banned gas warfare. This is 8 years after the world agreed that chemical weapons were too horrific to use. But the American planners write it into the operational orders anyway. Because in a war for resources, treaties are just paper. Let's walk through the invasion timeline. The plan assumes that war is declared at dawn. Within 6 hours, American forces will cross the border at 5 different points. The First Army will drive north from Vermont toward Montreal. The Second Army will cross the Niagara River and march on Toronto. The Third Army will sweep across the prairies from North Dakota. The Fourth Army will launch an amphibious operation against Halifax. The Fifth Army will blockade Vancouver and seize the naval base at Esquimalt. The goal is speed. The goal is to overwhelm the Canadian militia before Britain can send help. The planners estimate that the major cities will fall within 30 days. Occupation will follow within 60 days. Annexation will be completed within 6 months. The Canadian military in 1930 is tiny. The standing army has fewer than 5,000 regular soldiers. The rest are militia, weekend warriors with old rifles and no artillery. They have no tanks. They have no air force. They have no chance. The American planners know this. They calculate the entire operation will cost fewer than 10,000 American casualties. It is a bargain. For the price of a single division, America gains control of the entire Canadian industrial base. The return on investment is staggering. This is why the plan is not shelved. This is why it is updated year after year. Because the math makes sense. But Canada is not defenseless. In a small office in Ottawa, a man named James Sutherland Brown is watching. Everyone calls him Buster. Buster Brown is the Director of Military Operations and Intelligence for the Canadian Army. He is a combat veteran with a thick mustache and a deep distrust of Americans. Buster Brown knows that Canada cannot win a defensive war, so he writes his own plan. It is called Defense Scheme Number 1, and it is insane. Buster Brown's plan is to invade the United States first. The moment war is declared, Canadian flying columns will charge south across the border. Troops from Vancouver will seize Seattle and Portland. Troops from the prairies will drive toward Fargo and Minneapolis. Troops from Quebec will strike at Albany and Burlington. The goal is not to conquer America. The goal is chaos. The goal is to buy time. If Canadian forces can disrupt American mobilization for 2 or 3 weeks, it might give the British Navy time to cross the Atlantic. It is a suicide mission. But it is the only option. Buster Brown does not just plan. He prepares. He drives across the border in civilian clothes on weekends. He scouts roads in Vermont and New York. He sketches bridges. He identifies choke points. He notes where the telephone lines run, where the water towers stand, where the highways narrow. He is casing the invasion of his neighbor. And he keeps his notes in a locked drawer. Because if the politicians in Ottawa knew what he was planning, they would have him arrested. But Buster Brown does not care. He believes war with America is inevitable. He believes the only question is when. So he prepares for the day the tanks roll north, and he prepares to roll south first. Throughout the 1920s, there are moments when it looks like the war might actually happen. In 1927, a naval disarmament conference in Geneva collapses. Britain and America cannot agree on the size of their fleets. The talks break down in anger. Newspapers in both countries run editorials calling for war. The British press accuses America of imperialism. The American press accuses Britain of arrogance. Stock markets panic. Trade slows. The border feels less like a line of friendship and more like a tripwire. Then in 1929, the global economy collapses. The Great Depression hits America like a freight train. Banks fail. Factories close. Unemployment soars to 25%. Desperate nations do desperate things. There is fear in Ottawa that America might lash out, might look for a distraction, might decide that annexing Canada is a way to create jobs and seize resources. It sounds paranoid. But paranoia is just pattern recognition when the patterns are real. And then the villain enters the story. But the villain is not a dictator. The villain is a number. The number is 18. In 1931, Britain abandons the gold standard. The pound collapses. British purchasing power evaporates overnight. Canada, as a dominion tied to British currency, crashes with it. Canadian exports to Britain become worthless. Farmers cannot sell their wheat. Miners cannot sell their nickel. The Canadian economy enters freefall. Unemployment in Canada hits 30%. The government in Ottawa is broke. They cannot afford to defend the country. They cannot afford to feed the unemployed. They certainly cannot afford to pay back their debts to American banks. And the banks start circling. American creditors begin calling in loans. They demand payment in gold. But Canada has no gold. The vaults are empty. The Dominion is insolvent. And insolvency is vulnerability. This is the moment when War Plan Red stops being theoretical. In 1935, the United States Congress passes a bill to construct new military airfields across the northern states. The bill is sold as a jobs program, a New Deal project to put unemployed men to work. But if you look at the locations of the airfields, a pattern emerges. They build a base in Plattsburgh, New York, 100 miles from Montreal. They build a base in Selfridge, Michigan, 50 miles from Windsor. They build a base in Great Falls, Montana, 200 miles from Calgary. The runways are long, the runways are reinforced, the runways are built for heavy bombers, and the only targets within range of those bombers are Canadian cities. This is not infrastructure. This is staging. The pieces are moving into place. Canadian intelligence notices. Buster Brown sends frantic reports to Ottawa. He warns that the Americans are preparing for a first strike, but the politicians do nothing. They cannot afford to antagonize Washington. Canada needs American trade to survive the Depression. Canadian banks need American loans, so the government stays silent. They smile and shake hands while the concrete dries on the runways aimed at their capital. This is the trap of dependence. When you owe money to your neighbor, you cannot complain when your neighbor builds a gun pointed at your head. Sovereignty is solvency, and Canada is bankrupt. But history has a sense of irony. Just as War Plan Red reaches its final form, the world changes. In 1933, Adolf Hitler becomes Chancellor of Germany. In 1937, Japan invades China. Fascism is rising. The global order is collapsing. And suddenly, America looks at Britain and realizes something. If Britain falls to the Nazis, America will be alone. The Royal Navy, which had been a rival, becomes a necessity. If Germany controls the Atlantic, America will be blockaded. American trade will collapse. American security will evaporate. So the calculus shifts. Britain stops being a debtor and starts being a shield. And Canada stops being a target and starts being a buffer zone. In 1938, President Franklin Roosevelt travels to Kingston, Ontario. He stands beside the Canadian Prime Minister and makes a public promise. He says that America will not stand by if Canada is threatened by any other empire. The crowd cheers. But listen to the words carefully. Roosevelt does not say, America will defend Canada as a favor. He says America will defend Canada because Canadian soil cannot be allowed to fall into enemy hands. He is asserting control. He is declaring Canada to be within the American sphere of influence. The message to Berlin and Tokyo is clear. Touch Canada and you touch us. But the message to Ottawa is just as clear. You are ours now. War Plan Red is quietly shelved in 1939. The focus shifts to War Plan Orange, the plan for fighting Japan, and War Plan Black, the plan for fighting Germany. The color codes are retired. The maps are locked away. And for decades, nobody talks about it. During World War II, Canada and America fight side by side. They build the Alaska Highway together. They storm the beaches of Normandy together. They integrate their defense industries. The nightmare seems to be over. But the document survives. It sits in a filing cabinet in the National Archives, stamped classified, forgotten, but not destroyed. Then in 1974, a Canadian journalist discovers it. The plan has been declassified, almost by accident. Archivists are clearing out old files and they mark War Plan Red as open to the public. The journalist reads the invasion routes. He reads the chemical weapons authorization. He reads the annexation proposals. He publishes the story. The reaction in Canada is fury. The headlines scream betrayal. People demand answers. They ask how their closest ally could have plotted their destruction. But the reaction in the United States is different. American newspapers treat it as a joke. They laugh. They say, who would want to invade Canada anyway? This makes Canadians even angrier, because the laughter proves the point. America never saw Canada as an equal. America saw Canada as a resource, and resources do not get respect. Resources get extracted. Military historians do not laugh. They read the documents and see something chilling. The money allocated, the logistics mapped in detail, the budget line for poison gas. This was not a hypothetical exercise. This was policy. For nearly 20 years, the official strategy of the United States military was to prepare for the conquest of Canada. Not defense, conquest. And the motive was not security. It was control of nickel, of wheat, of hydroelectric power, of the Atlantic Gateway. This was not about democracy. It was about the balance sheet, about ensuring that North America's resources flowed south, not east. So what is the lesson? Alliances are not friendships. They are contracts, and contracts are only honored when both sides have leverage. In 1930, Britain was weak and Canada was broke. America had little to lose, By 1939, Germany and Japan had changed the math. Alienating Britain became too expensive. War Plan Red was shelved, not out of morality, but because the arithmetic no longer worked. Today, the US and Canada share open borders and joint defenses. But that trust is conditional. Geography has not changed. The nickel is still in Sudbury. The wheat still grows on the prairies. The power still flows from Niagara. War Plan Red was never executed, but the threat was real. Canada was saved by math, not mercy. Empires don't forget ledgers, and the bill always comes due.